I've been thinking about the fact that so many people who view my channel are from the United States of America, and having watched the recent AFC Championship game between the Broncos and the Patriots and many, many UFC pay-per-views, I feel like maybe I should structure the introduction along these lines. Alpha Draft is a simple and fun way to win money playing fantasy esports. Thousands have played contests, and prize pools have numbered into the millions. Side effects may include loss of Skrilla, frustration at players being subbed out unannounced, Dunning-Kruger self-wreckage, severe momentary existential crisis followed by internally spiraling into tilt-like states. If you want to play fantasy esports, make Alpha Draft your choice today. So, okay, there's a problem that has come to light which is quite drastic when you talk about great players and the impact that this can have on their career, which is that Diamondprox, legendary Western jungler, hailing from Russia, one of the all-time great players. He was a top 10 player of all time in my list of League of Legends players, is seemingly unable to compete in the EU LCS for Unicorns of Love, his current team and the team that he transferred to in the off-season, due to visa issues where he can't get a work visa to work in Germany, where he would have to live and work to play in the EU LCS. Now, the reason why it's significant is because it also touches on other issues we've seen with European players this season, but over in the NALCS, and in the past, there is a history of this sort of issue lying a bit dormant and not being a primary problem, and that in itself, it kind of points towards something and seems a bit suspicious. So, okay, here's where we start with this. Unicorns of Love came out with a Facebook post about 19 hours ago at the time of this video being recorded, where they said, we have some sad news to share. Diamondprox will not be part of the team this week and probably for the next incoming weeks due to visa issues. And they said that despite working closely with Riot, a visa specialized agency and German authorities in the German embassy, they had not been able to get a long-time permit. And that it's difficult to specify or identify pro gamer status within Germany, because normally the sorts of visas we're talking about getting for performers, is that me translating what they're saying, is for example, artist, performer, sportsman, technician. And unfortunately, at the moment, under German law, they can't get a visa which would qualify a Russian esports player as one of these things, despite the fact we think of him as a sportsman, or perhaps an entertainer, a performer, because he appears in front of a large audience, a technician, someone very skilled at a certain job that's needed in the country. Somehow they can't get this status passed. And so as a result, at the moment, they don't have any options to get him into the country to play legally in LCS. Diamondprox himself then, about an hour later, made a Facebook post. He said similarly that he's not allowed to play in LCS in regions he's not work eligible in, that German government doesn't recognize esports or League of Legends as a sport, and therefore he couldn't get a visa to play in it. And he's very sad about this. He's played in LCS for 3 years, and this had become like a home for him, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, right now, he has no options, and he's seeing what he can do. He's hoping he can still get a visa somehow, but right now, no obvious options. So reading up on this, it does seem, I obviously don't know much about German law. Someone did post something that seemed reasonable, where there's a clause within some sort of legal status that says to have this sort of a visa, you have to be, or to be work eligible, you have to be 16 years or older. You have to get paid 50% of 4,237.50 euros a month. So presumably he qualifies for that, even though actually a lot of EU LCS pros in the past wouldn't have qualified for that, with how much some of them made in like 2014 and 2013. And C, he has to have a qualification as an athlete to be confirmed by a responsible sports association in agreement with the German Olympic Sports Confederation. Now that's the problem there, obviously, is that even if he passed point A, obviously he does his over 16, point B, let's assume he makes a decent amount of money, point C is not going to be the case, is it? Because there's going to be no sports association that recognizes League of Legends players in Germany, and especially not the Olympic Sports Confederation. So here's the issue here, is first and foremost, we have to ask, how can this happen? Because this isn't just Diamondprox this has happened to. Within the last couple of weeks, this has happened in NALCS to European players. So Echo Fox, the team that was formerly Gravity, now bought by Rick Fox and renamed to Echo Fox, has three foreign players to some degree. They have Froggen, obviously from Europe, KFO, who as far as I know is from Korea, and Hard, I believe, is from Canada. And so these three players, despite playing in the first games, were then found that they did not have They hadn't been able to eventually obtain the proper US documentation to work in the US, and so they were actually forced to forfeit the game against NRG Esports, and at the moment, they are not playing in NALCS. Also, there was Freeze from Renegades, obviously a European player from the Czech Republic, and initially the Renegades post just said that it was for personal reasons he couldn't play, but it turns out, according to the Daily Dot at least, that the personal reasons are he didn't have the paperwork as well to be work eligible in the US. So here's the big issue here. On the surface, if you've only just started following League of Legends in the last 6 months to a year, you'll think to yourself, makes sense, right? You should be work eligible. That's the law. To earn money in those countries, you have to have the correct visa. You can't just be there on a tourist visa. But here's the problem. This should have been a problem for the last 3 years as well. Remember, Season 3 was when LCS began, and that was in 2013 at the beginning. So why has this not been an issue all the time before? So, what has changed is the real question, right? So, in Season 3, where were all the work visas for players then? Because, to my knowledge, so I'll have to say allegedly, and with a little bit of speculation, but a little bit of inside knowledge as well, as far as I'm aware, in Season 3, a number of players who played in NALCS, so initially, not many, obviously, because there weren't many imports, and then Season 4, as far as I know, the majority of these players did not have work visas, these P1 athlete work visas or whatever they're called. They did not have the documentation to legally allow them to work in the United States of America and earn income for a job and live under circumstances. They were all there on a tourist visa where you say the reason you're coming is for pleasure, tourism, just to spend time, and the whole point is it's explicitly meant to be not to earn money from working a job. As far as I know, allegedly, I will state that all these players, as far as I'm aware, did not have that visa and were all on tourist visas. So that means when Edward went over to join Curse, and within only a span of a couple of weeks, quickly somehow was able to work in the US, coming from Armenia, another country that's not exactly super famous for having great relations with other countries, come from Armenia, go and work in the US, that was because he was on a tourist visa, as far as I'm aware. All the EG players, Evil Geniuses, so Snoopy, Yellow Pete, Crepo, these players that were formerly CLG EU, and well, they weren't Alliance players, but CLG EU and Evil Genius players, coming over to NA to play in the NA EU team for Season 4. As far as I know, all on tourist visas. That's why you saw them going back again. So you saw them have to go home at certain points in time, didn't you? And then renew their visa. Why would they have to do that if it was a proper work visa that lasted a certain amount of time? Why would they have to go back after a couple of months or a few weeks or whatever the period of time? I think it was a couple of months like you'd expect, because normally it's 90 days you can do as a tourist from most countries. Then you have to consider Bjergsen. So a massive high-profile transfer of a European potential star player who's already a very good player going over to one of the biggest NA orgs, TSM. Why did he have to leave in the spring split of 2014 and go back to Denmark, and Reginald, the owner of the team, have to replace him in the lineup for a few weeks? And actually, if you remember, Reginald played pretty decently and even got the MVP on one of the weeks. Although we all know those MVP voting scenarios are fairly bullshit because Daylor fucking won it. He's not even a player. So the point is, in pretty much, it's not the case that you have to find the odd scenario where you have to speculate, I wonder if that guy was on a tourist visa. Almost every example in the past you could give for at least Season 3 and most of Season 4, as far as I'm aware, they all allegedly were on work visas. I would speculate they were all on tourist visas, rather, and did not have the proper work visas, despite the fact that is illegal as far as I know in America. Or I would allege it's legal. I don't fucking know. I'm not getting sued anyway, so who cares? So the big question here is not Diamondprox now being ineligible to play in Europe. It's the fact that logically there's no reason he was ever eligible to play in Europe. He has played in 3 years of LCS. He played both splits in Season 3. He played both splits in Season 4. Admittedly, he skipped some of Season 4 when he was benched for a little bit. He played both splits in Season 5. So he's played 6 splits of LCS, 3 whole years, and yet only now is he having these problems with being ineligible to get a work visa. Yet logically, think about the way it's phrased, that since he can't be recognised as someone who's working that way, and gaming is not recognised as a job, that means it never was recognised as a job, and he never legally should have been able to earn a salary and work within the EU LCS. Now, that's not saying I don't want him to play. I think he's a wicked player. I've always liked to watch him play, and I wish there weren't these visa issues and you could freely move these countries, or that they just acknowledged that gaming was a sport. But by the rules, they should never have been able to. So what that tells you, and remember, with Diamondprox, it applies to all the other players as well. Alex H, Darian, Genja. This actually tells you that they were all on tourist visas, because remember, they all used to go back every single split, and that's why sometimes they had to use subs, as they did in Season 4 and Season 5. Maybe not in Season 5. So technically, that was illegal. So Riot was allowing illegal behavior to go on, despite the fact that, if you remember, here's the problem. First and foremost, in Season 3, I think it was late in Season 3. I should have probably looked this up. But it's Thorin's thoughts. It's not an investigative piece of journalism, is it? I think it was late Season 3 when Riot made this big news post about how all athletes going to the US and were going to have these special visas that were for athletes, star performers, these sorts of things, and they'd all be getting this visa. Where were all those visas? Where were people getting them back then, or even for the next 2 years? Because the problem is, none of these huge names got it. What, Evil Genius is a massive org, couldn't get their players it. TSM couldn't get their player it. Curse couldn't get their player it, allegedly. So, in this scenario, what this suggests to me, and based on what I've heard, when you look at the case of someone like Broken Shard, for example, it seems to me, when he got turned down and he'd even gone through a lawyer and tried to get this proper visa and they wouldn't acknowledge it, I think what happened was, I think that Riot did go to a meeting with someone from the government, and the person from the government saw, they really sold them on this idea that, like, these are big orgs and there's a lot of money in this and this is a real sport now, and so these guys should be granted the visas. And I reckon the person from the government looked at that and thought, yeah, I do kind of agree with this, and let's work towards making this a reality. But then what I think happened was, as in the case of people like Broken Shard, who was playing for Complexity at the time, which was a small org, and is still not a massive esports org now, still working its way back into relevancy as it was from where it was like 10 years ago, when the industry was much smaller and it never had huge sponsors anyway. I imagine what happened is, when these government officials, either at border control, I don't know, immigration, visa control, whatever it might be, when these people looked at orgs like this, they were like, wait a minute, it's one thing to be saying that, like, the biggest org is like very professional and pays a lot of money and has a proper league. But wait a minute, some of these orgs are just tiny little orgs and they've only been in the league for 3 months and they have very small sponsorships, and actually they don't look like a huge industry. Actually, this looks like quite a small hobbyish amateur thing actually that's going on here. Hobby, amateurish thing going on here. And as a result, they either reneged on it or they just went back and they said, you know what, we're not going to just grant all these visas. So I suspect that's why people had a lot more difficulty getting the visas back then, which means that we would have to allege that Riot either turned a blind eye to it or knew they weren't work eligible to work in Germany or the USA, where you had to be eligible, and therefore were allowing these guys to essentially illegally earn salary. Now, here's what's interesting. When I looked into this factor, I found that, as far as I can tell, in 2014 and 2015, they had a note in their rulebook saying that you had to be work eligible in either the USA, I think it was North America, I can't remember the wording, or Germany, depending on which EU or LCS you're in order to play in the league. And if you didn't have the paperwork, you wouldn't be able to play. So then I looked it up, and it said here, and this is from the ruling that was on Echo Fox this season, it said, our previous work eligibility process was based on guarantees made by teams as well as high-level spot checks of visa paperwork. But given the seriousness and breadth of the allegations, it was clear that such a system was not adequate for providing eligibility in the case of disputes. Accordingly, we instituted mandatory submission of full work eligibility documents for all players. Now, the problem I have there is, I don't buy what they've just said there, because they're suggesting that they would do high-level spot checks, and that aside from that, they trusted the teams to believe that they had the paperwork, right? Is it really believable that Riot people themselves, who, by the way, some of them know a lot more than I do behind the scenes in certain cases like this, really looked at some of these players having to go back to their countries or going back at weird times or only been able to stay a few months and thought, they probably have their proper visa work. I won't do a high-level check of them. And if I did, I'll just say nothing, that they didn't have it. So unless my perspective is totally skewed, which I don't know, maybe it's possible, maybe the world's a big conspiracy, I don't know. It seems to me as if this is at best disingenuous, if not outright false, and that Riot actually has purposely turned a blind eye, mainly because, as I've referenced, they couldn't be expected to. It's not recognised as a sport in most of these countries, and we wouldn't be able to have these players playing in the leagues if we hadn't turned a blind eye. So in a way, bearing in mind, I'm not the US government, I don't really give a fuck if things are legal or not. There's a big difference between legal and moral, so just because the law of the land says something doesn't mean if I want it to be otherwise, well, what the fuck do I care about the law? Unless I get called in a court and this is later used in a video, in which case I'm entirely a law-abiding citizen. But if I'm not called in, then fuck the system. I'm a rebel and an anarchist, and I will never submit to your laws. But enough about that. Anyway, my point is, it does seem a bit shady the way this has all gone down, right? And as I say, here's the other factor. I also think it's highly suspicious that until this point in time, Riot's never made a really big statement on this. They've never come out and said, here's the thing, if you really did either have the visas or everyone was getting work visas, you'd be bragging about that, like they did when they thought they had the work visas. You'd be doing articles, oh, all the players in our league actually have official work visas, whereas in a lot of the other parts of the industry, people attend tournaments on tourist visas and they just play in the tournament there, whereas we have proper league with work visas and we check it. Oh, we also do high-level spot checks. We're really leading in the industry. You didn't really hear a lot of that, did you? You didn't really hear a peep about that topic once things started to seemingly go to shit, allegedly. I'll just keep saying that. I'll pepper it throughout, and maybe that will protect me. We'll see, guys. So, well, then again, apparently Riot doesn't really care about the law, so maybe nothing will happen. So, I also have to say that another reason why I have suspected this for a long time, I say suspected, didn't obviously have proof, so I can't necessarily say it was a fact, is because when I worked at a past site, we'll just leave that anonymous, shall we? When I looked at whatever past site this may be, let's just hypothetically imagine that someone at this site was an investigative journalist, or at least they called themselves that. That's what they considered their profession, and they were paid for that job, whether they did it or not. This person, who claimed to be an investigative journalist, was actually running down this particular type of story. He had a copy of someone's contract, and then he had a lot of information on it, and then he'd watched when the visas and when they were going back home to their countries, and he'd figured out that it did seem as though this person didn't have a work visa, despite the fact that Riot had claimed that people would be getting them, and supposedly you had to be work eligible legally to work in the USA. So this person was investigating this player, whoever that might be, hypothetically, for whatever team might exist or might not exist. And he decided, if he in fact was a he, to drop the story. And I actually later on said to this person, I'd like to potentially look at this story. Or let's imagine I said to him that. And he actually told me, you'll have to work on it yourself, and basically buried his leads and wouldn't even give me any of the information or evidence about it, which led me, or at least in my dream of if this had hypothetically happened, to speculate that either Riot had suggested he drop it in that sense, or he was afraid of rocking the boat a bit or getting into some hot water about this. And I'm very interested that so many investigative journalists around the scene must have had a sense of these particular issues, but didn't particularly do any work on it for whatever reason that might be. Whether it's hard to get the evidence or not, I don't know. I'm not an investigative journalist myself. That's why the fact I was even going to look into this is because it was so interesting that everyone wasn't doing it. I wanted to see what the problems were. Now, it is obviously an issue, aside from this, now we've got off the Riot part, it's obviously an issue that Riot Germany won't recognise gaming as a job, because there's kind of a thing that seems a bit counterintuitive, right? That they say, well, it's not a job what you're doing, and then you say, right, well, why can't I just do it without having the work visa? And so you say it's not a job, I can surely earn money for doing it. No, but you can't earn money for doing that. Why is that? Because that's a job and you don't have work visa. So, yeah, okay, that's just some German shit there, apparently. That's like bureaucracy at its finest. I mean, Germany and England both countries are pretty bad for fucking bureaucracy like that and stuff that doesn't make sense logically. I do think that this is not just a Riot problem. I just think that the way they dealt with it is kind of hypocritical. And they probably shouldn't have bragged about the whole issue to begin with. I think it's not just a Riot problem. It's more of an issue that they pumped up the idea that it was going so pro and gaming's so mainstream and esports so mainstream and League of Legends is an official sport and all this sort of guff, whereas obviously it's not the case. Now, it's also a problem in terms of Europe that they're hosting it in Germany, because it seems like Germany has more archaic, draconian bureaucracy in this particular respect than certain other countries. So maybe a solution would be holding it in another country. I don't know the status of other countries, so someone would have to look into this and tell us what some good options might be. I mean, one that people often bring up is obviously Amsterdam in the Netherlands, because that's, first of all, it's close to where the servers are for EU West. And also, I've always brought this up. The reason why I wish there was events in Amsterdam, aside from the obvious reason that I do at the minute that passes 4:19 p.m, is also because it's a great hub airport. So you'd be one flight from nearly everywhere in Europe. So it'd also be a lot easier to get there. But that's a side issue. And definitely every day. So there's also the factor that you could take away this work eligibility rule that you seem to have only started to enforce now, but that before, even though it was technically illegal, you weren't enforcing for whatever reason. I don't know if that means the governments behind the scenes have cracked down and said, right, listen, we have a sense of what's going on here, so you better buck your ideas. Maybe that's the case. If it's not, then why not go back to the old system and keep just somehow avoiding it? I mean, obviously, you probably can't do that now. Like, you brought the fucking topic up and started disciplining people. Because to me, it's kind of hypocritical that you can't get away with it now, whereas people were getting away with it before. Also, that teams that were getting away with it before, think about this, hypocritical motherfucking owners, the ones who themselves were doing this and illegally having their players work are the ones who reported some of these modern players now, just to get a competitive advantage by fucking with them. Great guys in the LCS, right? No douchebags there as owners, hypocrites, liars, fraudsters, conmen, pieces of shit. Definitely not. Perish the thought. So, also, let's be real. If Riot was ever going to enforce this, I mean, they might have been forced to now, sure. They probably should have enforced it from day one. So that sounds crazy, because I'm essentially saying that if this really is the law and they're going to follow the law, Diamondprox and Gambit should basically never have been able to play in LCS. And basically, we should have never seen certain players in an LCS. But that's not the way it was. So unfortunately, we're stuck in like a worst of all worlds, gradually getting worse scenario. So I think it's very unfortunate. I think it's a real shame that someone like Diamondprox is getting punished by this, especially when he found a new team, especially when the new team was doing well, especially when he revitalized his game. But I think it's a bigger issue than Diamondprox. I think it's a bigger issue than the LCS. I think it's a bigger issue than Riot. But at all levels, we need to look at some of the suspicious inconsistencies with what's going on here. And let's hope Diamondprox somehow can get this problem fixed. Because otherwise it's going to be, I think people will have a really ill feeling towards Riot and the way they've handled this overall if essentially a legend is prohibited from playing when in the past other people weren't. So, Diamondprox, Alpha Draft Skrilla. There's not even any connection there.